Look at him, a grown man cleaning tables. The rich lady's voice cut through the elegant restaurant like a sharp knife. The room had been filled with soft piano music and quiet conversations only seconds before. Crystal glasses clinked gently, and waiters moved silently between tables carrying plates of expensive food. But now the sound of Victoria Hale's laughter echoed across the room. Several people turned their heads. At the center of the attention stood Marcus. He wore a simple black uniform. The sleeves were slightly rolled up, and a white cloth hung neatly over his shoulder. In his hands was a tray stacked with empty plates. He'd been quietly clearing tables for the past hour. No one had noticed him, until Victoria decided to. Victoria leaned back in her chair with dramatic confidence. Her diamond bracelet sparkled under the golden lights above her table. She tilted her head slightly and pointed toward Marcus again. "I mean, seriously," she said loudly. "Just look at him." The people sitting with her followed her finger. Marcus froze for a moment when he realized they were all staring at him. Victoria continued. "How old do you think he is?" she asked her friends. One of the men at the table chuckled. 40, maybe, he guessed. Another woman smirked. Maybe older. Victoria laughed again. "And after all those years," she said, raising her eyebrows dramatically, "this is where life brought him? Cleaning plates?" A few people at the table laughed. Marcus stood quietly. His hands tightened slightly around the tray, but he did not say anything. He slowly walked toward the service counter and placed the plates down carefully. Behind him, the whispering and laughter continued. Victoria was enjoying every second of the attention. She crossed her legs and leaned forward slightly. "Hey, you!" she called out suddenly. Marcus paused. He turned slowly. "Yes, ma'am?" he replied calmly. Victoria smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they already think they are better than you. "Come here for a moment," she said. Some guests nearby shifted in their seats. Marcus hesitated for half a second. Then he walked toward her table. Every step felt heavier than the last. When he reached the table, he stood respectfully a few feet away. "Yes, ma'am?" he repeated. Victoria rested her elbow on the table and looked him up and down slowly. "You've been working here long?" she asked. "About 2 years," Marcus answered. Victoria tilted her head. 2 years, she repeated slowly. "And this is what you do?" Marcus nodded once. "I help keep the restaurant clean and organized." Victoria chuckled. "That's a very polite way to say you clear plates." The table laughed again. Marcus remained calm. "I suppose you could say that," he replied quietly. Victoria leaned closer. "Tell me something," she said, curious but mocking. "How does a man grow this old and still end up as a busboy?" The laughter from her table grew louder. Marcus felt the weight of dozens of eyes watching him now. Some people looked embarrassed, others looked curious, but no one interrupted. Marcus took a slow breath. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am." Victoria rolled her eyes dramatically. "Your job," she repeated. "That's not a job." She leaned back in her chair again and crossed her arms. "That's what failure looks like." A few gasps spread quietly through nearby tables. Marcus didn't move. For a brief moment, something painful passed through his eyes, but he swallowed the feeling. "My mother taught me something when I was young," Marcus said slowly. "No honest work is shameful." Victoria stared at him for a second. Then she clapped her hands slowly. "Oh, wow," she said sarcastically. "That's beautiful." She turned toward her friends. "Did you hear that?" One of them laughed loudly. "Very inspirational." Victoria shook her head with a smirk. "But let's be honest," she continued. "Some people are born to lead." She gestured to the luxurious room around them. "And some people," she added while pointing toward Marcus again, "just clean up after them." More laughter. Marcus lowered his eyes for a moment. Not because he was ashamed, but because he was choosing patience. Years ago, moments like this would have made him angry. Years ago, he might have shouted back. But life had taught him something powerful. Sometimes silence is stronger than pride. Victoria wasn't finished yet. She picked up her glass of sparkling water and took a slow sip. "So, tell me," she said again, pushing further, "did you ever dream bigger than this?" Marcus looked at her calmly. "I did," he answered simply. Victoria smirked. "And what happened?" Marcus paused. The restaurant felt unusually quiet again. "Life happened," he said. Victoria shook her head. "That's what people say when they give up." Her friends nodded in agreement. Marcus did not react. Instead, he gently straightened the silverware on the edge of her table. His movements were careful and precise. Victoria watched him. "You're very calm," she observed. "I've had practice," Marcus replied. Victoria laughed again. "Well, I hope you're good at this job," she said, "because I don't see you doing much else." Marcus finished adjusting the table setting. Then he looked at her directly. For the first time, his voice carried a quiet strength. "My mother taught me something else," he said. Victoria raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" Marcus met her gaze without anger. "Never measure a person's worth by the job they do." The words hung in the air. Victoria stared at him. Then she clapped her hands loudly again. "Oh, please," she said dismissively. "That sounds like something people say when they don't have money." A few more laughs came from the table. Marcus simply nodded. "Have a good evening, ma'am," he said respectfully. Then he turned to leave. Victoria waved her hand dismissively. "Yes, yes, go clean another table." Marcus walked back toward the service counter. His steps were steady, but inside, the moment still lingered. Behind him, the restaurant slowly returned to normal conversation. Victoria's table continued laughing and talking loudly about luxurious vacations, expensive watches, and private yachts. To them, Marcus was already forgotten. Just another worker in the background. Just another man they believed had failed in life. But at that exact moment, the front door of the restaurant opened with a soft chime. A tall man stepped inside. His presence immediately changed the energy in the room. His posture was straight, his eyes were sharp, and when he looked around the restaurant, they suddenly stopped on Marcus. What happened next would silence the entire room. The restaurant door opened with a soft metallic chime. A tall man stepped inside. The cool evening air followed him through the doorway for a brief moment before the door slowly closed behind him. Almost instantly, several heads turned. There was something about the way he carried himself. His posture was straight. His shoulders were firm. Every step was calm, controlled, and confident. He wore a dark navy suit that fit him perfectly. The jacket rested sharply across his shoulders, and his polished shoes reflected the golden lights of the restaurant floor. But it wasn't the suit that caught people's attention. It was his presence. The kind of presence that made people look twice. The kind that suggested discipline, strength, and experience. At the center table, Victoria noticed him immediately. Her face lit up with excitement. Her eyes sparkled as she quickly sat up straight. "Daniel!" she called out brightly. Several guests turned to look at her. The man near the door heard his name and smiled. Then he began walking toward her table. Every step was steady and confident. As he approached, people moved their chairs slightly to give him space. There was something respectful about the way the room reacted to him. When he reached the table, Victoria stood up quickly. She wrapped her arms around him. "You're finally here," she said warmly. Daniel Brooks smiled and hugged her back gently. "Sorry I'm late," he said calmly. "Traffic was worse than expected." Victoria waved her hand dismissively. "It's fine," she said playfully. "We just started dinner." She turned proudly toward the people sitting around the table. "Everyone," she said, straightening her posture, "this is my fiancé, Daniel." Her friends instantly became more attentive. One of the men stood up quickly to shake his hand. "Nice to meet you," he said politely. Daniel shook his hand firmly. "Good to meet you as well." Victoria continued proudly. "Daniel is a Navy SEAL officer." Her voice carried a tone of admiration and pride. Several people at the table reacted immediately. "Wow, that's impressive. Thank you for your service." Daniel nodded politely at each comment. "Thank you," he said calmly. Victoria looked at him with admiration. "He just returned from a mission overseas," she added. Daniel smiled slightly, but didn't say much. Instead, his eyes slowly moved around the restaurant. Years of training had made it impossible for him not to observe his surroundings. Every entrance, every table, every movement. His gaze moved across the room quietly. Then, suddenly, his eyes stopped. Across the restaurant, Marcus was stacking plates near the service counter. For a moment, Daniel simply stared. His expression changed instantly. His confident calm on his face shifted into shock. His eyes narrowed slightly as if trying to confirm what he was seeing. Marcus. It couldn't be. But it was. Daniel took a slow breath. 3 years had passed, yet he would recognize that face anywhere. Marcus picked up another tray and turned slightly. Their eyes met. For a brief second, time seemed to stop. Marcus immediately recognized him too. His expression didn't change dramatically, but his body stiffened slightly. Daniel slowly stepped away from the table. Victoria noticed instantly. "Daniel?" she said, confused. But he didn't respond. His focus remained locked on Marcus. He began walking across the restaurant floor. One step, then another. The quiet conversations around the room slowly faded as people noticed his movement. Some guests looked curious, others watched silently. Victoria frowned and crossed her arms. "What is he doing?" she whispered to her friend. Her friend shrugged. Daniel continued walking. His heart was beating faster now. Memories were rushing back. Explosions, gunfire, smoke, pain, and one man who refused to leave him behind. Marcus. Daniel finally stopped a few feet away. Marcus placed the tray down slowly on the counter. For a moment, neither man spoke. They simply looked at each other. Years of memories filled the silence. Then Daniel spoke. "Marcus?" he said quietly. Marcus nodded once. "Good evening, Lieutenant," he said, calmly, respectfully. The title sounded strange inside a fancy restaurant, but it carried deep meaning. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I can't believe it's you." Marcus gave a small, modest smile. "Been a while." At the table across the room, Victoria leaned forward, trying to understand what was happening. "Lieutenant?" she whispered to her friends. "What is he talking about?" Her friends looked equally puzzled. Back near the counter, Daniel stepped closer. His voice was quieter now. "You disappeared after the mission," he said, curious concern. Marcus looked down briefly. "I had to come home," he replied. Daniel studied his face. Then his eyes dropped to the uniform Marcus was wearing. The black busboy uniform, the white cloth over his shoulder, the tray of dishes. Something inside Daniel shifted. Respect, gratitude, and deep emotion. Without another word, Daniel straightened his posture. His back became perfectly rigid, his shoulders squared. Marcus noticed immediately. He knew that posture well. Before Marcus could react, Daniel's hand rose sharply to his forehead, and in the middle of the restaurant, he gave Marcus a full military salute. The movement was sharp, precise, respectful. The sound of silverware stopped. Several conversations died instantly. The entire restaurant fell into stunned silence. Marcus froze slightly. He hadn't expected that. Daniel held the salute for a moment. Then he lowered his hand slowly. At the table across the room, Victoria's eyes widened in disbelief. Her mouth fell open. "What?" she whispered. Her friends looked equally shocked. Daniel turned slightly toward the table, but his voice remained focused and serious. "This man
Daniel said clearly, pointing toward Marcus, is the reason I'm alive today. Gasps spread through the restaurant. Victoria stood up slowly from her chair. "What are you talking about?" she asked loudly. Daniel looked back at Marcus. There was no doubt in his eyes. Only respect. Only gratitude. Marcus shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "You don't have to do this," Marcus said quietly. Daniel shook his head. "Yes," he replied firmly. "I do." The restaurant remained silent. Every guest was now watching. Victoria slowly walked closer, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. Her confident smile from earlier had completely disappeared. Her voice was quieter now. "You're saluting the busboy?" she asked carefully. Daniel's expression hardened slightly. He looked directly at her. "He's not just a busboy," he said. Victoria looked confused. Then she laughed nervously. "Well, whatever he used to be, he works here now." Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. He turned back toward Marcus, then back toward Victoria. "You judged him 5 minutes ago, but you don't know who he really is." Victoria crossed her arms. "Then explain it," she said, defensively. Daniel looked around the restaurant. Dozens of curious faces stared back. Then he took a deep breath. His voice became calm, but heavy with memory. 3 years ago, he began, our unit was trapped during a mission. The entire restaurant fell completely silent again, and Victoria suddenly realized the story she was about to hear was going to change everything she believed about the man she had just called a failure.
Victoria stood frozen in the middle of the restaurant. Her confident smile from earlier had completely vanished. Instead, confusion and disbelief filled her face. "What are you talking about?" she asked Daniel again. Her voice was no longer loud or mocking. Now it carried hesitation. Daniel looked at her quietly. Then he looked back at Marcus. For a moment, memories filled his mind. Smoke, gunfire, dust, the sound of helicopters in the distance, and one voice shouting through the chaos. He took a slow breath. "You called him a failure," Daniel said calmly. Victoria shifted uncomfortably. "Well," she muttered, crossing her arms, "look at him." Daniel's expression hardened slightly. "That's exactly the problem," he replied. "You're only looking." The restaurant remained completely silent. Every guest was now listening. Daniel turned slightly so his voice could be heard clearly. 3 years ago, he began slowly, our team was sent on a rescue mission overseas. Victoria's friends leaned closer. Daniel continued. It was supposed to be simple, but things went wrong. His voice became heavier as he spoke. Our helicopter was forced down. We were surrounded. Marcus stood quietly near the counter, his hands resting calmly on the tray. He had heard this story before, but hearing it here felt different. Daniel continued. Billets were coming from every direction, explosions everywhere. Victoria listened with wide eyes. Daniel pointed gently toward Marcus. He was our combat medic. Victoria blinked. "A medic?" she whispered. Daniel nodded. "The best one we had." Marcus shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Daniel continued. "In the middle of the fight, I got hit. The room felt heavier. Shrapnel from an explosion," Daniel said, touching his side unconsciously. "I couldn't move." Victoria slowly covered her mouth. Daniel's voice softened slightly. "I remember lying there on the ground. I couldn't feel my legs. I thought that was it." Marcus lowered his eyes slightly. Daniel continued. "The enemy was getting closer. Our team had to move." Victoria looked at Marcus again. But Marcus didn't leave. Daniel's voice grew stronger. "He ran through gunfire to reach me." The guests around the restaurant exchanged shocked looks. Daniel continued. "I remember him grabbing my vest. He imitated the moment slightly and shouting in my face, 'Stay awake, Lieutenant.'" Marcus gave a small, embarrassed smile. Daniel shook his head slightly. I told him to leave me. I said I'd slow everyone down. Victoria's eyes were fixed on Marcus now. And you know what he said? Daniel asked quietly. Victoria shook her head. Daniel's voice grew emotional. He said, "You're not dying today." The restaurant remained silent. Marcus looked down again. Daniel continued. He lifted me onto his shoulders. Victoria's eyes widened even more. He carried me, Daniel said, intense emotion, for nearly 2 miles, through gunfire, through explosions, through darkness. Several guests looked stunned. Daniel's voice trembled slightly. I passed out halfway through. The last thing I remember was Marcus shouting at me again, "Stay with me." Marcus closed his eyes briefly, remembering that night. Daniel continued softly. When I woke up, I was in a military hospital. Victoria's voice came out as a whisper. And Marcus? Daniel looked at him again. He saved 3 other soldiers that night. Gasps spread quietly through the restaurant. Victoria slowly turned toward Marcus again. You did all that? She asked in disbelief. Marcus shrugged slightly. It was my job, he said simply. Victoria looked overwhelmed. But why are you here? She asked, confused. Marcus paused. Then he answered honestly. My mother got sick, he said quietly. I left the service to take care of her. Victoria's eyes softened. She needed someone, so I came home. And when she passed away, he added quietly, I stayed. The room felt heavier again. Daniel spoke gently. He never told anyone about what he did. Marcus shook his head slightly. Didn't feel necessary. Victoria looked down at the floor. Her earlier laughter echoed in her mind. Her words. Failure. Busboy. Shame. Now they felt unbearable. She began slowly. Her voice trembled. I didn't know. Marcus nodded calmly. You didn't ask. The words were simple, but they hit harder than any insult. Victoria swallowed. Her confidence had completely disappeared. She slowly stepped closer to Marcus. The entire restaurant watched. Her voice was quiet now. I'm sorry, she said softly. Marcus studied her face. He could see the change. The arrogance was gone. In its place was something real. Embarrassment, reflection, and maybe understanding. Marcus gave a small nod. Everyone makes mistakes, he said calmly. Daniel crossed his arms and looked at Victoria. You judged him in seconds, he said, serious, but his story took years to build. Victoria nodded slowly. I understand that now. Marcus picked up his tray again. The familiar movement reminded everyone that he still had work to do. But before he turned away, he looked back at Victoria. Respect doesn't come from money, he said calmly. It comes from character. Daniel smiled proudly. Victoria stood silently. For the first time that evening, she had nothing to say. Marcus returned to clearing tables, but now the room looked at him differently. Not as a busboy, not as a failure, but a quiet hero. Victoria slowly walked back to her table and sat down. Her mind was racing. For years she had believed success meant wealth, status, and luxury. But tonight, a man in a simple uniform had shattered that belief. Across the room, Daniel watched Marcus with deep respect. Then he said something quietly to Victoria. Some heroes wear medals. He paused. And some heroes carry trays. Victoria nodded slowly. And in that moment, she learned something powerful. Sometimes the person the world overlooks is the very person someone else salutes as a hero.